Hey there, history buffs, and welcome to this episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. I am your host, Thomas Carroll, and today we have our first return guest. We welcome back Rob Hilliard. Now, Rob has written on sports, history, and the outdoors for over 3 decades. Rob started as a reporter for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review and has written articles for outlets such as Upland Almanac, Pennsylvania Wildlife, and Pittsburgh History Magazine. In 2012, his first book, A Season on the Allegheny, was published. It quickly hit the top 10 in two Amazon categories and has garnered national attention since its publication. Rob's newest book, entitled In Freedom's Shadow, is due out November 17th, 2023. It's up for pre order now on Amazon, so I suggest you go out and pick it up. It's an excellent book. So without further ado, let's welcome Rob back to the show. Hey there, history buffs, and welcome to this episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. I am your host, Thomas Carroll, and for the first time rejoining me is Rob Hilliard. And if you remember, we talked a couple months ago about the Allegheny National Forest, and now you have your brand new book out, In Freedom's Shadow, which you were kind enough to lend me an advance copy. And I recommend to anybody, I'm just going to plug it now, go out and get it. It is a wonderful book, Rob.
Well, thanks very much, Thomas. I obviously appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate you inviting me back on the show. It's great to talk to you again, and I'm excited to be back on.
Yeah, I guess maybe this podcast is starting to make it a little bit when you start to have repeat guests.
Maybe so.
So
That might
let's
be a good indicator.
let's get a brief synopsis of the book, and I want to let everybody know because you address this in your book. This is a based on a true story. It's not 100%, but from what I've read and researched briefly since I went through it, I'd suffice to say it's probably 97, 98% historically correct.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, and so just to kind of hit that head on, the basis of the story itself is, well, quick synopsis, I guess. Um, there was a man named John Scobell who was a slave in Mississippi on a plantation prior to the outbreak of the Civil War. And once the war started, just as happened with many other people across the South, his master volunteered for the Army, for Confederate Army. They went north into Virginia around the time of the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. But what happened with Scobell was he escaped, got across ultimately into Washington, D.C. And so that's from that point, I guess I'll do this is a little different from the previous book because it was nonfiction. And as you said, this one's fiction. This one is also a spy thriller, so I have to be worried about spoilers, which I didn't. I didn't have to worry about with A Season on the Allegheny. But I'll give your listeners a small spoiler here, at least. When Scobell got to Washington D.C., the person who was the head of what was then called the Secret Service, but it was basically the intelligence service or spy service for the Union Army, was Alan Pinkerton, who was the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And Pinkerton he had been hired by General George McClellan, who at that time was the head of the Union Army. He Pinkerton was interviewing the many escaped slaves who were coming across from the South into the North. So they were being picked up by Union soldiers. They were kind of, gathered together and brought to Washington to be interviewed by Pinkerton and his team of operatives. And the reason they were doing that was, what better source of information about Southern troop positioning, numbers of soldiers, armaments, all those kinds of things, than people who had just been there. And obviously, the escaped slaves were more than happy to provide that information where they could, because anything they could do to help the Union Army win the war was going to benefit them and benefit their families and friends who they left behind who were still enslaved. So um, that was the process that was going on at that time. And like I said, Pinkerton was interviewing these people. When Scobell came through and Pinkerton interviewed him, he found out a couple of things that made Scobell stand out. For one thing, he could read and write, which most slaves could not, primarily because it was illegal to educate slaves in the South at that most of the South at that time. Um, and so that gave him an advantage. But he was also um, intelligent, quick-witted, quick to pick up on things. So because of that, Pinkerton actually recruited Scobell to join his Secret Service and become an undercover spy for the Union. And the way we know all of this is about 20 years after the Civil War ended, Pinkerton wrote a book called The Spy of the Rebellion, I believe was the correct title. And he talked about a number of his operatives who were in his Secret Service during the Civil War. But he talked specifically about Scobell, and he told the story that I just told, that Scobell came to him, he interviewed him, he liked him, he thought he would be a good fit, so he recruited him into his service, and then he sent Scobell back into the Confederacy, of course, in the guise of being a slave, on two separate missions. One where he went south through down the eastern shore of Maryland, and then up into northern Virginia. And then a second one where he accompanied another female operative um, that worked for Pinkerton, and they actually went into Richmond, which was of course, the capital of the Confederacy, and they were spying within arm's reach of the Confederate White House in Richmond. So, so that part we know all that to be true. Um, there are, of course, lots and lots of unknowns in between there, and so my approach to writing in Freedom's Shadow was to take that skeleton and put some meat on the bones. And originally, when I first heard about this, and I worked on the book for it's a little bit over 7 years now since I started. It was the summer of 2016 when I started, and the my original intent was to actually write another nonfiction book about Scobell. Um, but when I found out how thin the source material was, there just wasn't, other than just regurgitating what Pinkerton had written. Um, there wasn't much to tell. So the more I thought about it, and again researched what was known, I decided that writing a novel was the best way to approach it. It was something that I always kind of wanted to do anyway. And so, like I said, I took the approach of using that as a framework, and then trying to put some meat on those bones and develop it into a fully fleshed out story.
And you already kind of got where I was going to head to with it next. I wanted everybody to see why it had to. Well, I shouldn't say had to be, but it pretty much ended up as a based on a true story, because there's just records of escaped slaves from the South just don't exist.
Yeah,
They didn't keep track of that. I mean, John Scobell, most likely that was not even his real name at birth.
you're
Uh,
absolutely right. Yep.
so
And
the record, yeah, he was one of the more well known uh, escaped slave turned spy. And even then, there's just the information is not there. The records don't exist.
yeah, you're exactly right. And so just to kind of dive into that a little bit, like I said, Pinkerton wrote about him in his book. The way I stumbled onto Scobell was just a an article. I was, like as so many people end up having happen to them, I went down a little Google wormhole, rabbit hole, and was looking for something else, and sort of stumbled onto this article that was actually written. It was actually on the CIA website, and it was called Black Dispatches, and it talked about exactly what we're talking about here, how these slaves were coming across and they were being interviewed to gather intelligence, and kind of drew some parallels between more modern um, times when you might have deserters from an army, or again captured people, and they would be questioned to get intelligence, to gather intelligence, or even refugees, which in effect the slaves were, and um, so that they're a great source of intelligence, and these escaped slaves, served that same role. Um, so, but one of the things that this wasn't really addressed in the CIA article, but again, as I was doing more research, there are some historians, and I guess I maybe should preface all this by saying I don't consider myself a historian. I'm a student of history. I enjoy it. Um, but I'm standing on the backs of others when it comes to research. I research things, but I'm not, going to the National Archives and going through all those things. I'm basically leaning on some really excellent research that other folks have done over the last century and a half. But the um, there are some, at least one anyway, historian who claims that John Scobell was not a real person, and the reason is there's no documentation beyond Pinkerton's book. On the other hand, there are many um, very learned, legitimate historians who believe that he is a real person, and what they'll point to is exactly what you just said. So you have a man who was, first of all, born into slavery, so there's no record of him. Second of all, he was a spy, so there wasn't very much. Spies don't typically have a lot of documentation. Even the ones today that we know are spies, or people from, let's say, World War II or the Cold War that we know are spies, there's still sometimes scant information about them because they're spies, right? And it's in their best interest to keep things hidden. And the third reason is really because of Pinkerton's approach, and when he wrote his book, which was that he named um, people who at the time of the Civil War, their names became known because they were, well, in one case because they were discovered, which again I don't want to get too far into spoiler territory here, but so their names were in the newspaper, and so he names them by name. But there were other agents who worked for him whose names did not did not become publicly known during the Civil War. And so when he wrote his book, even though it was 20 years later, he used pseudonyms for them. He used different names. And um, one of those was the female agent that I mentioned a minute ago. And but it's entirely possible that one of them was Scobell as well. And so, you have somebody who had no documentation of their birth or really their life because they were a slave. Then they became a spy. Then, when the story of their spying was ultimately told, it's entirely possible that the author Pinkerton used a pseudonym to continue to disguise their identity. And so, when you combine all those things,
Yeah.
um, again, it's nearly impossible to, at the distance of 160 years, 160 plus, to sort through all that and go backwards and lay hands on that documentation that would really give you the answers that you'd like to have. So
Yeah. And even worse, to add one more ripple to it, any of the records in the South at the during and at the end of the Civil War, who knows how many of those were destroyed?
right, yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, they know in Richmond, in the capital, when, in spring of 1865, when the Union Army was basically closing the noose around the Capitol, they did burn a bunch of papers that were kept there. And so, yeah, as you said, who knows what went up in flames or what disappeared at that point. So, one thing that I'll mention on that note, though, is um, one of the things that inspired me as I was, like I said, it took me 7 years to slog through this thing. So I needed the occasional kick in the butt to keep going. But probably about a year after I'd started on the book, um, my son and I were driving home from a Christmas party, and we were talking about. I was talking to him about some plot ideas that I had and how, kind of an outline of what I was thinking the story might be. And I was, reiterating some of the things that we just talked about that were kind of the known part of the story, and then how I might blend that into the plot, the fictional plot. And at some point in the middle of that conversation, Jake, my son, just stopped me and he goes, "You have to write this story." And I said, "Well, I intend to. Like that's what we're talking about here, right? That's why we're having this conversation." And he goes, "No, no, no. You don't understand what I'm saying." He said, "Scobell has been lost to history for 150 plus years, and you have to tell his story." He said, "This guy was a hero and people have forgotten him or not even know, don't even know his name. You have to give him his voice back." And so as uh, you know, over the ensuing years, when I got to points where I was just like, you know what, this just isn't worth it anymore. Or, I think every author gets to a point where they start writing something and they reread it and it's like, this is just crap. I'm not, I've wasted all my time. But when I got to those points, I thought back to that conversation, and this was really, one of the great benefits of doing a story that's a novel that's based on a true story is I would go back to that and think about what Jake said and just say, you know what, I do need to, like, even though I don't maybe feel like pushing forward and keeping going, in a way, I owed that to Scobell to tell his story and to give him a voice. So that's been like I said, that's been kind of my inspiration along the way to just keep pushing when at times I didn't feel like pushing anymore.
And that's great because I've been passionate about the Civil War since I went to Gettysburg as a 8-year-old Boy Scout. And up until I heard about your book, I never even realized that any of the slaves had turned spy and went back, which I couldn't even imagine doing that. You spend all your time getting out, and then you're going to go back in and spy. So yes, this is what's great about it. This is all new to me. You know,
Yeah, and it's well, thank you again for saying that, but um in a way, well, not in a way, it was new to me too. Like I said, I kind of stumbled onto this by accident, and when I read that CIA article, um, that essay, obviously it was done by somebody who's knowledgeable about spying and spycraft, and comes from an intelligence background. So that was that gave it an immediate legitimacy, right? Because it wasn't written by some knucklehead like me who just wrote something down. It was somebody who's in the business of spying, and so, but it was kind of eye opening in a way, and to your point, and we think of, um, you mentioned Gettysburg, and people tend to think of the Civil War in terms of the great set piece battles, right? You have Gettysburg, you have Fredericksburg, you have Vicksburg, Shiloh, on and on for 4 years worth. Um, and obviously those all mattered. I mean,
yeah,
those were the things that ultimately, in the fullest sense, decided the war. But just like modern warfare, some of the underpinning of that was espionage. And I have two quotes that are in the, or will be in the final version of the book when it comes out. And forgive me, I don't remember. Like you said, you got an advanced copy, so I can't recall if they were in there or not. But one was from Frederick Douglass, and it's he was I can't quote it in full off the top of my head, but he basically said that when the war is over, the greatest source of intelligence information will be from the escaped slaves who got to the north, and that their bravery and their willingness, their determination to get to the north and to share that information with the people who were trying to liberate them was a story that that needed to be told. And again, obviously, I'm paraphrasing. And then the second quote was from Robert E. Lee. His was much shorter, and he said, "The greatest source of intelligence to the Union Army is our Negroes." And the same thing, people who were either escaping or as the Union Army moved through the South, later part of the war, and they were freeing those slaves as they were taking more ground in the South. And under the Emancipation Proclamation, then of course those people became free. But same thing happened then. They were interviewing them, even though Pinkerton was long gone by that point, but they were interviewing them and gathering intelligence about who from the Confederate Army had just been there, maybe days before. So those two quotes I kind of introduced right at the very beginning of the book. Again, just sort of reinforcing um, the fact that even at the time, even during the Civil War, people recognized that the escaped slaves were a tremendous source of intelligence for the North. And then Scobell, of course, was the notable exception that went even further by not just reporting what he had known, but actually going back into the Confederacy undercover.
Yes, you may know, you may not know. I wonder, because you'd mentioned that they interviewed the uh, escaped slaves who sought refuge in the North. Like Scobell was picked because he could read and write, and he had a higher level of intelligence because he was educated throughout his youth. But the ones who maybe couldn't read and write after their interview, where did they end up?
That's a really good question. So, um, in fact, I'm really glad you asked. This is a subject I wanted to kind of get to. Very early in the war, I want to say it was the fall of 1861. I might be a little bit off on the date, but it was in that ballpark. And of course, for people who may not be Civil War nerds like you and me, the war broke out in the spring of 1861. The first big battle was Bull Run, which was the summer of 1861. And like I said, I want to say it was in the fall of 61. Um, there were at Fort Monroe, which was in, and I should know this right off the top of my head. I think it was Maryland, Eastern Maryland, but right close to the Chesapeake Bay. And it was a place where Virginia and Maryland come very close together. And there were a couple of slaves who had escaped from the Confederate lines and made it across and made it into Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe at that time um, was headed by a guy named Benjamin Butler, who was one of the kind of political appointee generals at the outset of the war. He was from New England. I'm pretty sure it was Massachusetts. Um, and he was a lawyer prior to his service in the Civil War. So he really had no um, military background at all. Like I said, he was more of a political appointee. Um, by all accounts, during and after the war, a first class jerk. Nobody seemed to like him. He was later in the war, he was the military governor of New Orleans, where they absolutely hated him. And there are some kind of funny stories about that, but I don't need to get off on that sidetrack. But when he was at Fort Monroe, it was a small number, two, three, four slaves had escaped and made it inside of the fort. And the commander of the opposing Confederate forces at that time sent a note over to Butler and said, you need to return our slaves. They're our property. And Butler, being a lawyer, and not particularly, also being an abolitionist and not particularly wanting to get the slaves back, sat down and thought it out and said, you know what? If they are not people, as the South claimed, if they are in fact property and they are now in Union possession, then we are declaring them to be contraband, and therefore they don't have to be returned. So it would be just like, and I hate to draw this parallel, but this was the legal basis of it, as if they had captured, cannons or horses or something like that in the course of battle, and they they wouldn't return that because it was contraband. It was considered contraband material. So of course the Union Army wouldn't be expected to return it to the South, or to the Confederates. And so Butler basically used their own words and thought process against them by saying, well, if slaves are property, then we have captured your property. And guess what? We're not giving it back. And so that became, like I said, the term that he used was contraband of war, but it actually set a precedent that spread across the entire battlefront of the entire Civil War. And in effect, it opened the door because once, well, first of all, most importantly, President Lincoln agreed with Butler that that was a legal mechanism that they could use to allow these escaped slaves to stay. And there were, there were a lot of, there have been a lot of analyses over, again, 160 years of who was an abolitionist, who wasn't, what, how did it serve this person or this party or this group to free the slaves or not free the slaves. And I'm not, we could have a week-long conference on that, and we certainly don't need to, and I'm not educated enough to do it anyway. But Lincoln agreed with that particular piece, and it served him and the Union because every slave that came from the South and came to the North, and Lincoln essentially said this, that and was not returned to the South, that meant one less person working on plantations and economically supporting the South. That meant one less person, maybe one less soldier in the army, because if the soldier had to go back and work on a farm, then they're not carrying a gun, right? And the South was also using slaves to build fortifications. That's, in fact, the slaves that escaped to Fort Monroe. That's what they were doing. So they were building forts. They were, serving, not serving in, but serving the Confederate Army as enslaved people. And so every one of them that left was one less, essentially one less person that the United States Army had to fight against. And even though they weren't, directly fighting against the slaves, but so that was Lincoln's approach. He agreed with Butler's decision, and that just threw open the floodgates. And so these people were escaping. They were kind of given this contraband label, if you will. Well, once it started being a few, and then a few dozen, and then a few hundred, and then a few thousand within a relatively short time, suddenly the folks in the North started to say, okay, what are we going to do with all these people that are coming across, right? They have no place to live. They have no way to support themselves. They have no, no method of existence. So they set up a couple locations, one at Fort Monroe, later in the war, one further south, on the eastern coast of South Carolina, I believe it was, might have been North Carolina. But they set up these contraband camps. and the contrabands were kind of sent there where they could live. It was, and I talked about this a little bit in the book. It was a little bit of an odd existence where they were no longer slaves, but they weren't really quite free either. They couldn't leave, they couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't come and go as they pleased. There was always the threat that if somehow the South won the war, or if they were to take over the contraband camp, of course, all those slaves would have been immediately pulled back into slavery in the South. Um, so it was kind of odd from that standpoint, but they they were given jobs, they were being educated, they were being paid for their work nominally, not a whole lot, but they were being paid. They were being educated, they were being clothed and fed, and some of those jobs were farming, so they were growing their own food and feeding the contraband community there at those locations. So that's a very very long answer to the question, the short question that you asked, but that is what was happening with the slaves who were escaping and coming, excuse me, coming to the north. They were given this contraband status, and that's how they remained really until the end of the war. And at that point, it was kind of rolled into the entire Reconstruction process, which again is a much broader topic. But and so that was kind of the process or the mechanism under which those people escaped and
And
stayed north.
yeah, and that's an interesting way of how they went about doing it, because I'm sure some people now would just hear some of it and go ballistic, but that's just the way it was. They weren't really considered people, uh, and
Yeah.
on both sides. I will say
Well,
that
in some
on both
cases,
sides.
yeah, in some cases for sure. And it's really interesting in the research I've done and some of the reading that I'm continuing to do. Um, it's what you just said is correct, but yet there were other people on both sides, mostly in the north, but a few in the south, who really were abolitionists and thought there should be full equality. But then there were all these sort of grades in between, right? People who were completely on the opposite side who thought, well, blacks are just not human or are subhuman and should always be slaves. And I even, kind of gave a little voice to that in the novel just to show how ridiculous that is. Um, but I want to touch on that just to show that was some of the mindset. But almost, like I said, almost every grade in between. So there were people who thought that they shouldn't be slaves, but yet if they were freed, they shouldn't be full citizens. There were people who, wanted the abolition of slavery, but then after the war, they were like, well, no way should we allow blacks to vote. And then, of course, there are other people who were like, there's no distinction. They're people just like us. They should have every right to live like we do. So, like I said, almost every gradation along the line, and different people thought differently. And that, again, that was one of the things that I tried to touch on a little bit. It wasn't intended to be a um, any type of essay on the human condition. Obviously, it's intended to be a spy novel, but
Right, right.
I wanted to at least allude to some of those things to kind of point out that there were people who had different thoughts about those relationships between the races.
Right. And like now we will move maybe a little bit towards the Pinkertons themselves. There may be quite a few people who don't realize how they started, because we're fairly close to Pittsburgh. We should be fairly familiar with the Pinkerton Agency as hired guns as strike breakers. But
Yep.
this is where they really got their start at the Civil War as a
Yeah,
fledgling agency.
at least on a national basis. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, um, just to touch on the strike breakers and the Homestead Steel Strike, which is um, might be the thing that the Pinkertons are most notorious for, not maybe not famous, most well known for. It's kind of ironic in a way because that was 1892. That Alan Pinkerton, who founded the agency, was long dead by then. I think he died in the 1880s, and it was his sons who were running, the Pinkerton agency at that time. Um, but you say the Pinkerton name, and people who know that history or certainly know their union history immediately say, "Oh, wow, they were strikebreakers." Another thing that they're somewhat well known for was after after the Civil War, the Pinkertons were called in to try and break up the James gang, Frank and Jesse James, and that was the their involvement in it. And Alan Pinkerton was hands on in that. That was maybe early 1870s, if memory serves. Um, and it ended quite disastrously. Again, I won't kind of get into that story, and I don't know the details of it well enough to even relay it. But there was a Pinkerton man that was killed. They tried to raid the James house. I think somebody else who was kind of an innocent bystander was killed or badly injured. There was an explosion. It went bad in a horrible way. So that's the short version of it. But most people know Frank and Jesse James, and they may know that there was a Pinkerton connection there. Back to your question, Alan Pinkerton came from Scotland to the U.S. I want to say in the 1840s, if I remember right. Ultimately settled in near Chicago, and he was um, had been hired at one point to help um, break up a theft gang, and was successful in doing that, and that led him to founding his detective agency. Um, and then, as that grew in prominence, they did a lot of work for the railroads, which were a huge emerging industry at the time and subject to theft. Everybody's heard about train robberies. I just mentioned Frank and Jesse James a minute ago. And so they were in need of protection. And his Chicago was at that time really emerging as a rail center, kind of the gateway to the Midwest after Pittsburgh was the gateway to the Midwest a couple decades later. And so he just happened to be in the right place at the right time, made those relationships. So when the Civil War broke out, there was the United States had no intelligence service. There was no CIA, no FBI, no Secret Service. There was the protection. I'm sorry, the president had no protection detail. Um, None of the things that we know today existed in that, like I said, as far as intelligence service. And they hadn't really needed any, up to that point. But the one of the parallels that I like to make is the outbreak of the Civil War was very similar to the start of the Cold War. And the reason I say that is when the Russians, literally threw up the Berlin Wall and put a block between East and West Germany, it happened virtually overnight. And the same thing really was true. The same conditions were true of the North and the South in the U.S. Effectively, the South said, "Okay, we are an independent country." They didn't physically put up a wall like the Berlin Wall, but overnight, you had two warring nations that shared a common border. And just like with the Cold War, when that happens instantly overnight, nobody gets a warning to say, "Oh, I'm going to go be on the side where I want to be." It's you wake up in the morning and you read the paper and say, "Oh man, my sympathies are with the North, but I live in the South," or vice versa. And all of a sudden, there's a blockade between free movement across there that wasn't there the day before. And just like in the Cold War, a lot of the people who were on the, what I say, the wrong side of the line, the side that they didn't agree with, rather than trying to get themselves back, they just decided to become spies for the other side. And so the other thing to keep in mind is, although it's not quite a parallel with Berlin, which was one city divided in half, but Richmond and Washington, D.C. are only about 90 or 100 miles apart. So you had these two warring capitals that yesterday were not opposed to each other, and today they are, right? The day after the war breaks out, all of a sudden, well, not literally, because Richmond didn't become the capital until a few months after, but as soon as that happened, you had these two capitals so close together, and you had people who, again, had maybe opposing sympathies who were sort of trapped in each of those locations. So they became spies against whatever side, the North or the South, whatever side they happen to be living in. So because of that happening, there was a recognition at the Army level and at the president's level, President Lincoln, that they needed to have some type of spy service, but they couldn't just put one together overnight because you have to recruit people, you got to hire people, you got to do all those things. So their solution to that was to bring in Pinkerton. And the reason, what enabled that was his involvement with the railroads. And again, railroads were very high visibility, high importance industries, particularly once the war broke out, because that's how they moved troops and goods and materials. And but also some of the relationships that he had established there. One of those relationships was with George McClellan, who relatively early after Bull Run, late 1861, I can't remember the exact date, but he was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, the main branch of the Union Army. And he brought Pinkerton with him because McClellan realized that he needed that intelligence, and he just basically picked up Pinkerton and his detectives and moved them from where they had been to Washington, D.C., and they set up shop. Like we would talk today about a security contractor working for the U.S. government. I mean, essentially, it was the same thing. And so he brought a dozen ish of his operatives with him, and then hired a few more after he got there. And one of the significant things they did that really solidified their position, this was really prior to Pinkerton being brought into the role that I just mentioned, but when Lincoln was traveling after his election from Illinois to Washington, D.C., of course, he was traveling by train. There was it's known as the Baltimore plot, but there was a plot that was identified by Pinkerton and his agents to try and assassinate Lincoln on his way through Baltimore from Pennsylvania. He was going, I think, from Philadelphia through Baltimore to Washington, because that's how the train routes ran. And so that plot was identified, and two of his operatives, Tim Webster, name you'll recognize probably from reading the book, and another one, Kate Warren, who was one of his famous operatives, they worked together to basically sneak Lincoln into Washington. They took him, instead of from Philadelphia, they took him to Harrisburg and commandeered a special train and sort of snuck him in overnight, and got him safely to Washington, D.C. So that was, what would that have been, April of 1861, or maybe just before that. And so when McClellan proposed the idea later of using Pinkerton as that, government security contractor or intelligence contractor that I just mentioned, Lincoln was fully in favor of it because he'd already had that interaction with Pinkerton and his operatives, and they may have even saved his life. Hard to know what might have happened had it gone otherwise, right? But so all of that was the lead up to Pinkerton and his operatives functioning as that intelligence arm of the Army. One quick note on that is that depending on who you ask and how you look at it, they did a decent job of gathering intelligence. Now, McClellan was always kind of crying wolf and saying, well, the Confederates have twice as many or three times as many people as I do. I need more soldiers. I need more of this. I need more cannons, more, whatever. And he never wanted to fight. And that was one of kind of the real, that's why he got fired ultimately. But it was one of the real criticisms of him. Pinkerton, because he and Pinkerton were good friends, what was happening was Pinkerton would get pretty reliable information back from his spies, and then he would inflate the numbers in terms of what the Confederate troop sizes were. And then McClellan would take those and inflate them again. And then when he was reporting it to Lincoln or to the other generals of the army, it was, it was many times what the reality was. And so the there's been justifiably a lot of criticism of Pinkerton over the years in that spying role. But by the time that he and McClellan were kind of shown the door, or before that time, one of the sources that I read pointed out that they knew, and like by the time of the Peninsula Campaign, where McClellan first tried to march on Richmond, by the time that happened, they knew almost every Confederate unit and knew what their real troop size was. That wasn't what they were reporting, but they knew what it was, and they knew what their armaments were. And so, it wasn't the terrible spy that he's sometimes uh, portrayed as. It wasn't that he was so bumbling that they didn't gather the right information. It was just not reported accurately because he was kind of doing what his boss wanted to do and effectively sort of kissing up to the boss and inflating the numbers to make it look worse. So all of that is to say, and this is what I like to say, Pinkerton was a fantastic, groundbreaking detective. He was a middling spy, and he was a horrible writer, which is what I talked about earlier. So that's kind of my short version of everything I just told you there, as far as Pinkerton. So
So I want to ask if there's anything extra you want to add, because I have a million questions, but every single one of them will definitely give something away. And like you said, I don't want to do that. So if there's anything you want to freely add here yet.
I appreciate that. One one thing that I maybe talk about, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, having read it. Um, One of the things that I struggle with as far as the uh, physical construction of the writing of the book was writing in dialect. And, so where I had a hard time was, I don't, I'll just be straight up. I don't particularly like reading books that have a lot of dialogue in them. It's always a little clunky when you're trying to read it because the eye just doesn't flow across it. And I didn't particularly like writing it either, frankly. But the reason I did it was because, like, again, to use a different example, let's say we were talking about somebody who was undercover during the Cold War in East Berlin, and you could just say, he said to the person, "Please let me in perfect German," right? You could just put the phrase in perfect German there, and it's 100% clear that he's talking as an undercover agent, right? The struggle with Scobell was everybody speaking English. So I had to have a way of showing when he was sort of using his undercover voice as opposed to when he wasn't using it. And the only way that I really landed on to be able to do that was, using that dialect and when he was sort of talking like a slave and then, not talking like a slave in different parts of the book to show that distinction. Um, and I struggle with that. I hope, I was successful in doing that, but I'm interested in hearing your feedback on that as a reader.
Yeah, actually, I know what you mean. I've read other books like that, and it can be tough, but yours seem to work fairly well because, as you said, it creates the distinction of his almost two personalities.
Right.
He really had two personalities. He was much more educated than other slaves were and could speak English well, which would have just stood out like a sore thumb, whether he was a spy or not.
Or not. Exactly. Exactly.
So I almost think you had to make that distinction somehow.
Yeah, and that's what that you hit the nail on the head. It was drawing that distinction, but of course, drawing it for a reader, right? It had to be on the page, or else you couldn't.
Yeah,
It wouldn't make
exactly.
sense. And so, well, I'm glad to hear that. I will tell you that I tried to make that as minimal as possible. In other words, just enough to make it clear that he was talking this way versus talking this way. And as you said, in different circumstances, because he wouldn't want to be discovered. Um, but without making it just over the top where it was just clunky and hard to read and off-putting. I really didn't want to do that. So um,
Yeah,
I'm
no,
glad to hear your feedback on that,
yeah,
because, like I said, that's something that's been, that's nagged at me from almost the beginning, because I didn't know another way to couldn't come
it
up with another.
definitely does. And in fact, in this case, I'd say it even heightens the character more to a degree. You get a better feeling for who the character is. Because even in real life, as him in real life, he would have had to speak that way to even some other slaves so they could kind of understand him even.
Right. Or
So
again, not that he wouldn't stand out
yeah.
in that circumstance either. So I know we're both tiptoeing around
Yeah,
not saying certain
exactly.
things.
Maybe it's best if we quit tiptoeing around before we do crash into the full on thing, and then everybody knows. So,
Right.
well, Rob, when is the book coming out? Where can we find it?
It will be out on November 17th, and it will be available in both ebook format and paperback on that date. You can go on Amazon right now and pre-order it, or Barnes and Noble, or multiple other sites. Um, Amazon, for whatever reason, they won't let you pre-order the paperback. They'll only let you pre-order the ebook, the Kindle version. I believe you can pre-order it from the paperback, that is, from Barnes and Noble, however. And I know you can pre-order the ebook. So it will be available at all those places beginning November 17th. It should be available, if they don't have it in stock, at your local bookstore, whatever that might be. They should, well, first of all, ask them why in the heck it's not available, why they don't already have it on the shelf. But they should be able to order it. And it should be available at almost all outlets, including independent bookstores. So
And I will share the link for everybody where they can pre-order the ebook version of it. Uh,
appreciate that.
I, I look forward to the day it comes out, and I just want to plug it again to everybody. If you have any interest in the Civil War or spies or thrillers, it's a definite. Definitely have to read it.
Well, thanks again, Thomas. I really appreciate that. And that's really, you kind of touched on there one of the things that I've been focused on with the book. I really wanted it to be, at its heart, a spy thriller. I mean, that's really where I thought it, and I think it has a lot of the traditional elements, tropes of a spy thriller. There's, again, without spoiling too much, but it starts with a border crossing, which is, every spy novel is like, well, we're trying to get across from here to here, trying to get out of enemy territory, right? And that's the opening scene in the book. And we already talked about some of the undercover missions, and um, uh, you know, decoding messages, and a
Yeah,
lot of those things are in there.
you can't, and
Um,
you can't have a spy book without somebody sneaking around in the dark.
right, exactly. And there's no shortage of that. So,
Yeah.
And that's really what I wanted it to be. But at the same time, I think it does, um, cross over the bridge into also being a historical novel. And that seems to be historical fiction. That seems to be the part that um, readers like yourself and some other folks who've read it are, that's the feedback they're giving me is they really like the historical part, the knowing what Richmond was like during the Civil War, what Washington was like, and just talking about the muddy streets and the cobblestone sidewalks and all those types of things. um, People seem to latch on to that, so hopefully it'll appeal to both audiences, and it'll cross over there, but we shall see.
Oh, I believe it definitely will. So, Rob, thanks again for talking to me about it. Like I said, everybody order the book, order it, go out, get it. If your bookstore doesn't have it, tell them to get it.
Well,
Oh,
thanks a million again, Thomas. I appreciate it. And I should have started with this right up front, but thank you very much for taking the time to read it and give me your feedback. I mean, I thank you for having me back on the show and for the kind words, which I certainly appreciate. But just for offering to take some hours out of your busy lifetime and read through it, I really appreciate that.
thank you too.